There's a story of two monks, and what I could say next would be anything, because there are always stories about two monks. In this particular story, two monks are watching a flag, and the wind is blowing, so the flag is moving like this. And they're getting into this very heavy argument, and one of them is saying that the wind is moving, and the other person is saying, no, it's the flag that's moving. And they argue back and forth and back and forth. And I feel I recognize this conversation from college. I had neighbors in the dorm who were philosophy majors, and they were usually kind of intoxicated in the evenings. They would sit around and they would have these wonderful conversations with, what if we're not even here? What if we're not having this conversation? And I would sit in the background and think, oh, please let that be true. So these two monks are having this kind of argument. And a third monk, there's almost never a third monk in these stories, but there's a third monk in this one. He comes up and he says, you're both wrong. Your minds are moving. It's a pretty good answer. It's not bad. It's a way of cutting through the fact that they're not participating. They're just standing back and trying to formulate some sort of idea about the world. But we can talk about the story in another way. We can also say maybe they weren't asking the right question. Maybe they weren't asking enough questions. It's not just simply, is the flag moving or is the wind moving? Is the wind blowing the flag? Is the flag waving the wind? Is there something that goes beyond that? Is the flag flagging? Is the wind winding? And are those separate things? And is it none of the above? And is it all of the above? I kind of suspect all of the above. I want to talk a little bit tonight about the scope of our actions. And as a way of moving into that, I want to talk about Zazen, which may seem backwards, because in Zazen we don't really move. When we sit down to do Zazen, we take this posture, we hold our backs very straight, and we place our hands just like so. And we keep our eyes open. And just a little bit down, we stretch our heads to the sky. And we breathe. So the only thing that's moving is here. And if you were to walk in on someone doing Zazen, you would think, well, they're totally still. And you might think that this is the opposite of action. But for everyone in the room who has done Zazen, you know that that's not true. You're doing a lot. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. Just like in the story, just because someone is sitting still, it doesn't mean that they're still. Their mind is all over the place. And if we could put a microphone to their brain, we'd be shocked at what's going on in there, even as they're trying to do just this one thing, this one very simple thing. But on another level as well, it's not passive to sit in this way. When you choose this posture, and when you choose to hold your hands like this, and you choose to hold your head like this, and you choose to be here and not somewhere else, it's very deliberate. Sometimes people come to me and they say, oh, it's wonderful that you do Zazen. That sounds like a very nice practice, but actually, it's not really for me temperamentally, because I need a practice that's more about movement. I need to move. Yoga's good for me. Dance is very good for me. But if you believe that dance, for example, does not involve stillness, then you don't know how to dance. And likewise, if you believe that being still is the opposite of action, then you haven't even started yet. And so people come to me sometimes, and I give them the basic rundown about Zazen, and they try it. And if they have a background in dance, for example, if they have a background, a serious background, or if they are athletic, if they run marathons, if they have spent some time engaging with their body, then they sit very still in this way and they breathe in this way, and then when we're done, they say, oh, I recognize this. This is not foreign to me. This is familiar. Even though what they just did is so different from the activity that they usually do on the outside. It's important as we think about action to think about what is moving and what is remaining still. So as you listen to me, I have a request / suggestion, which is, I would like you to choose the way that you sit. And by that I mean, even if it's just the way you're sitting now, notice where your foot is on the ground, and think, I choose to put my foot just like this. This is where I want it. And my arm on the armrest, I want it just like this, and feel what this feels like. Feel how different it is to say, I'm sitting deliberately. Because the fact is that when you really sit, you sit with every cell in your body. It's total. It's as active as running as fast as you can. So make note of where you are and choose it. And then we'll keep on. I really like talking about my time in the monastery, and I really like to go back into the monastery for the same reasons. When you enter a monastery, a Zen monastery, every single thing you do is prescribed. There are rules. It's not a suggestion. So of course the way you do Zazen is you sit in just this particular way. But then when you stand, you always stand like this. And this is why usually I wear a different robe. The robes are so long, the sleeves are so long, because if you drop your arms, you lose your hands. So you always walk like this. And it's a reminder. And you maintain this posture. And you walk around. And if you have to sit down, you sit like this. And when you have to stand up, you bow. And you get up. And you bow. And if, for example, you need to move an object from one place to another, you move all the way to the object. And you take it with 2 hands. And when you set it down with 2 hands. And if you drink with 2 hands. If I do it with 1 hand, I'm going to multitask. I'm going to find something to do over here. And we think it's so wonderful that we can multitask, that we can do more than one thing at a time. But the fact is that multitasking is like breathing. It's actually more difficult not to do it. This is one of the first things we discover in Zazen. We sit down and we face the wall. And we find that we feel a need to accomplish something. We start making grocery lists. As long as I'm going to sit here, at least I'm going to figure something out. But to really just do this one thing is so hard. So a monastic life is set up around encouraging that, just that. That whenever you do this thing, you do just that thing and nothing else. And then you move to the next thing and you do just that thing. When we bow, it has to be very precise. And people are watching. They're making sure that we do it just like so. And we bow. And we come down. And the right hand goes first, and then the left and the forehead. And hands go up. And down. And back up. And we bow. And so we live out our day in this very choreographed way. It can seem very strange, and in the beginning everyone resists. Everyone wants to do it their way. And eventually you give into this, and you give into it in part just, to get everybody off your back. Well, I don't want to hear about this anymore. And it becomes second nature to do it just like that. Maybe it was unnatural in the beginning, but a year later, you think, well, this is how you sit. This is sitting. And when you stand, you think, well, this is standing. And then, and everyone has this experience, you leave the monastery, and you go to your hometown, and you go to a friend's house, and you're all sitting around talking, and you're sitting around the kitchen table, and you realize you have no idea how to sit. I remember this experience. I remember sitting at a normal chair and thinking, how did I used to do this? I'm used to sitting like this, but this is sitting. But no one's watching me. There's no rule. And it certainly isn't that you have to do it just that way. Not at all. So you start trying it out. But that doesn't seem right. And what you discover is that everything you do is a choice. I can choose to sit like this. But now, if I sit like this, it's because I decided to sit like this. And then you get up and walk, and you realize the way I walk is something that I'm choosing. I may not always be choosing it consciously, but I know I can walk this other way. So if I'm not walking like that, there's something deliberate about this. And it can really throw you off. You realize that everything you do is something you're deciding to do. Well, then what are you going to do? If I have to choose how to walk, then there must be a best way. But of course, none of this is about there being just one way. The practice we do in the monastery, we don't stand that way because that's the way you have to stand. We don't walk that way because that's the way you have to walk. It's just a vehicle. It's a place where we can explore the idea of doing things fully. So that what we bring to our action is not a specific way, it's a flavor. It's a quality. And as I describe this, I imagine that some people are thinking, well, that sounds really unnatural. It is. But that's okay. It's okay for spiritual practice to feel a little bit uncomfortable. It's actually supposed to. Spiritual practice is not something we choose to fit us. We adapt ourselves to another way of being. That's why there's something to learn. I think we hope sometimes that spiritual practice, if we get kind of interested in that it'll be like a pair of socks. And that we'll put it on, and we'll think, oh, this feels good, and then we'll forget that it's there at all. Because it's so seamlessly a part of what we do. That would be great. But the reality of practice is it must be a little bit self-conscious. Especially at first. When people sit down to do Zazen in the beginning, sometimes it's better than it is later because they're so invested. They have this idea, oh, I have to do it just like the same. And they pour themselves into that action. And then later it gets kind of goofy. And then they get a little bit softer. You know, they sit down and immediately they feel kind of basically okay. And then they start thinking about other things because it's no longer so hard. They lose that sense of making a choice. Over time, the things that feel difficult now, and that feel unnatural now, or that feel forced now, become just the way you do things. It completely changes in quality. But for now, if you feel this is awkward, if you feel what I'm recommending tonight is awkward, that's good. That means you have something to work with. It won't feel that way if you let it be continuous. In the same way, we might listen to someone saying, you have to do everything 100%. You have to throw yourself into this action. You have to do things very consciously. And you might think, well, that sounds exhausting. I can do it for a little bit. But no one can live like that. You'd be worn out. But again, it's because we don't make it continuous. We treat it like a job. We treat it as a means. We get into spiritual practice thinking we're going to get something. And someone says, well, you should do Zazen, for example, but it doesn't have to be Zazen. Someone says, well, you should do Zazen, and you think, okay, I'll do that. I'll do that, but I'm doing it because I know there's a payoff. There's something coming my way. And so I will lay the groundwork for that. In the same way that when you go to work in the morning, you think, well, there's a reward. And you work from 9 to 5, and when you get home at 5, you throw yourself down on the couch and say, oh, that was hard. Long day. What this means is, for example, if you're an accountant, I say that because my dad was an accountant. If you're an accountant, if you come home at 5 o'clock, and you throw that away, and you say, oh, that was a hard day, it means you are not identifying as an accountant. You don't imagine that this is what you are. This is just something, this is a face you put on sometimes. And you tolerate it for the hours that you're required to. But your real you is something else. Your real you is tired. But the fact is that practice, whatever shape it takes, is not a job. And, at the risk of everyone getting up and walking out, there's no reward. And by that I mean, you don't sit and sit and sit, and then you get something at the end of the day. You don't engage with the world by taking up your life with 2 hands and then get something at the end of the day. You don't get a break at the end of the day. You don't get a gold star at the end of the day. What you discover, though, as you do this, is the reward of practice is practice. That the energy of your life comes from putting energy into your life. And the realization that you get, even though you may have come to Buddhism, for example, wanting some sort of wisdom or some sort of divine realization about the nature of the cosmos. Often these realizations arrive in bulleted lists. You know, people seem to kind of wake up from these knowing suddenly the 5 shadow aspects of mind or something like that, and then they preach them from the mountain and everybody says, good work. That's okay. But that's not the realization that we talk about in this practice. Realization in this practice is realization in the sense of making real, of making something actual. And what you're actualizing is your life. And what you're discovering is not some philosophical something. What you're discovering is the vastness of your life. You're discovering the vastness of your potential, the limitlessness of what you can do right now. And you're discovering it right now. And then if you're like most people, you're forgetting it, and then discovering it again, and then forgetting it, and then discovering it again. And we do this our whole lives. It changes, but we also keep coming back, and coming back, and coming back. So I'm asking you to choose the way that you're sitting right now. I can ask you to choose the way that you're breathing right now. I can ask you to choose the way that you're listening right now. To make every single thing you're doing. And again, I stress this point because probably when you sat down you thought, well, I don't have to do anything until 9 o'clock because he's going to do it. That's what we do in movies. To make everything that you're doing a complete action. I ask you to do this, and then you might think, well, but really, what's the point? We have this belief, a very deep belief, that I am separate from what I am doing. That these are 2 different things. But from at least a Buddhist perspective, that's absurd. We do this all the time. If I go to a party, not that I do this, but I could. If I went to a party and people were dancing, and someone said, oh, come on and dance. First is what's going to happen is I'm going to say, I don't really dance. I'm not someone who dances. And they'll say, oh, you have to dance. So maybe I get pulled onto the floor. And I'm dancing. And even as I'm dancing, I'm saying to the person across from me, I really don't dance. We say this with a straight face. But it's ridiculous. Of course I dance. Who is this person that I think doesn't dance? Who is this story that I'm carrying around? Who is that character, and why do I think that that character is somehow more real than the one who is dancing? But we do this all the time. I wouldn't usually do something like that. I wouldn't do that, but that person did that. It was interesting. We limit ourselves in this way every day. Because we have a story about what we do and do not do. I'm someone who does this a lot. Oh, good. I don't do this kind of thing. So usually we never get to the dance floor. Because we decided a year ago, or 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 30 years ago, that I don't do that. It's very strange. When I was a kid, I hated Brussels sprouts. Hated them. I think that's natural as a kid. And it took until I got married to eat Brussels sprouts again. and there was actually someone that I loved and trusted and maybe feared just a little bit, saying, no, eat them. And I ate them and I discovered they were delicious. But if it had not been for her, I still today would never have eaten Brussels sprouts. Not since I was probably 10 years old. And I would have this story. Well, I'm someone who I don't like Brussels sprouts. And the I that I'm identifying with is someone who got up every Saturday morning to watch cartoons. That's the person that I'm letting control my behavior right now. That is the person that I'm letting define me and hold me back. It's amazing, our capacity for this. So even just that is a pretty interesting reason, I think, a pretty compelling reason to explore what it means to act fully. Because we hesitate. We hesitate all the time. Not for any real reason. Someone says, would you give a speech? It's like, no. I don't do that. You should ask this person over here, because she does that. I'm a type. She's a type. It's easier that way. But there's more to this. Because it's not just that it's limited. It's not just that the story about who I am has placed limitations on what I can do. It's that this story about who I am is irrelevant. Who am I? And what am I doing? Well, right now, I'm sitting here in front of all of you, and I'm speaking. I can tell myself all sorts of stories about this, and I can do it while I'm talking, because I can multitask. So I can say, well, I'm the Zen priest, and I'm talking. And I'm the Zen priest that's leaving, so there's this other kind of drama to the story, right? Because this is my last talk, and so I can feel, the weight of that. And there's music playing, it's a little song. And then I can tell the story about who all of you are in relationship to me. But the fact is that none of that makes me better at doing what I'm doing. I can say, well, I'm the guy from Montana. But that doesn't really help me with what I'm doing. What I'm doing is, I'm speaking. In this moment, the fact that yesterday I did something else is really not very important. I can't say that it really defines me at all. I'm defined, if I'm defined at all, by what I'm doing now. I can only be who I am now. I cannot be someone else. And I say it, and it's so simple, but I have to say it again. I can only be who I am in the present moment. It is literally impossible for me to be anyone but that. How would it work? How can I do what I'm doing and not be the person who's doing that? And so I am self-defining. On the simplest level, it's like, who am I? I'm the one who's speaking. But it works the other way too. Speaking, this action in this moment is who I am. What else am I carrying? If I shake your hand, it's so fraught with politics. It means so much. We tell ourselves stories like crazy. We reach out. This is the action. It's so simple. And yet I know, oh, this is someone I need to impress. Or this is someone who needs to impress me. This is someone whose status is higher than mine or lower. This is someone with whom I'm going to have a relationship beyond today. Or this is someone I'm just meeting casually and I'll never meet them again. If it's a really, really big guy, and the guys are going to nod their heads a little bit, it changes the way you shake hands just a little bit. If you know that this guy can crush you, you kind of, you put a little extra into it. You don't want to be shown up. You want to at least participate in that. But all of this strategizing, all of this storytelling, all of this idea about who I am, who it is that is doing this, gets in the way of doing it. The extent to which I hold on to that story is the extent to which I fail to act. And so when I shake your hand, I have to be a professional handshaker. That's my job. In that moment, that's my function. That's my role. If I am to shake your hand with any integrity, then that's all I should do. And when you speak to me, I can be a listener. I can be listening. Listening can be who I am. And when I speak, I can be a speaker. Not Koun, the speaker. Not the priest who is speaking as kind of incidental aspect of who he really is. But the act of speech. When I walk, I can be walking. Imagine the next time that you wash dishes, that this is your role in the universe. Because either you're going to do it or not. If you're not going to do it, don't do it. If you're going to do it, don't do it half-assed. There's on and there's off. But we spend almost our entire lives somewhere in the middle. Halfway doing this and thinking about this over here. We drive to a destination, we have no idea how we got there. We could draw a map. But we listened to the music in the car, and we thought about things, and we made plans. And maybe we rearranged something in the passenger seat so that we'd be ready for us when we got to the place where our real lives were going to take place. And then we get out of the car, and all that time just disappears. But that's your life. I find myself coming back to this one point all the time whenever I talk about Buddhism. This moment is the climax of your life. This is it. This is the end of the movie. Oh, and now this is. And now this is. But if you imagine that this is an intermediate chapter that's on the way to the place where your life really happens, you'll miss the whole thing. If you imagine that there is some moment in your life that is not worthy of your attention, then by definition you're right. Because you make it that way. But if you discover that there is no moment in your life that is not worthy of your attention, then you realize my life has been at 100% the whole time. If this is not your real life right now, sitting here in the Lusac Library, what is? And when is it going to happen? What are the prerequisites for your life to be actual? Because, and I find myself saying this a lot too, you're going to die. And you don't get to know when. It could be today. I hope that's not the case. But we never, ever, ever, ever know. We hold on to statistics. And we say, well, I can't how many people. Realistically, we're probably okay today. But one day you're going to exhale, and that will be the last thing you do. What will have been the right moment to give it 100%? By the way, giving your life 100% of your effort doesn't mean that you have to run around crazy and accomplish a lot of things. This is not about your resume. This is not about people looking at you and saying, that person really works hard. It's about when you sit in the car and you put your hand on the steering wheel, feeling your hand on the steering wheel. Everybody try it. Just take a minute to think what it feels like to put your hand there and realize you probably haven't felt that for a long time. Think about what it feels like to open the door. If you have hair, think about what it feels like to comb your hair. Not just to get it done. I could stop there. And I feel okay. But I want to go one step further with this. Just as you are defined by what you are doing in this moment, reality is defined as this moment itself. Reality cannot exist somewhere outside of the present. Where would it be? If we want to ask ourselves, where is reality? It's here, always. This is always the location. And this moment contains you. If it didn't, it wouldn't be this moment. It would be a different moment. A reality that doesn't include you is not this reality. It's a different reality. Which means reality is resting on your presence. This one is. This moment cannot be this moment minus you. So just as your actions are defining you in this moment, your actions are defining this moment. They are giving shape to this moment. They are the quality of this moment. You are shaping reality. You are shaping the world. Your actions do not exist in isolation. They don't. And when you feel that, this moment, you have to do something. You don't have the option to do nothing. Even doing nothing is doing something. If you do nothing, then that's the flavor you're giving to reality. If you act completely, if you act thoroughly, if you throw yourself into your life, that's the flavor that you give reality in that moment. But there's no escape from this. You're stuck. And what you're doing is all that you have. And if that's all that you have, it means that's all that you have to give. And you're giving it. If I shake your hand, that's my offering to the world. That's me reaching out. And it's not just me shaking your hand. I extend my hand. And I extend the hand of the universe. And the moment shakes hands. And the moment meets itself. We have this phrase, kan no dojo, in Japanese. And it's something like mutual self-creation. When two things create each other at the same time, like teacher and student. The teacher creates the student, and the student creates the teacher, and if one of them is gone, the equation doesn't happen. It's like this between you and everything, all the time. I realize that's a really big thing to say. You create the nature of this moment with what you do and with what you do not do. And the moment responds. So you ask yourself in this moment, what do I have to offer? What do I have to give? If I shake your hand, am I going to do that in a way that is a gift? Or am I going to hold back and wait for the moment that I think is right? When we talk about action in this tradition, we at first break it down into this one, and this one, and this one. But we're talking about something bigger than that. Let go of your story about how you're supposed to do something. Let go of your story about how what you're doing now fits into your life. Let go of your story about whether you are the appropriate person to do this or not do this. Do not withhold yourself. Don't be selfish. Don't hold back. Don't hesitate. That's what I want to say.
This is the moment for some questions. So how about the gift of a question?
I'm really happy to talk about anything, or nothing, but I have to say, I feel so fortunate for this chance, and this is the fourth of the series, and every time it's been really fun to get people's questions. Don't feel like you need to ask a question about what I just talked about. Buddhism's a great, big, crazy world.
So many things that we love, like poetry and music, involve remembering and forecasting in the future. You know,
Yes.
remembering something and thinking of a word about it.
Yes.
Or remembering a song and then thinking of how you play the song. What you're saying seems really foreign or against the idea of art, of remembering and forecasting. So I wonder how if you have this mental presence in right now, how do you do a poem? How do you play a piece?
Well, thank you. I'm glad you asked that question, because I think that's something to clarify. We don't have the option to forget what we've learned. It's happened sometimes, but we don't get to just shut it off, I don't think. So we carry all these things. And the present moment includes those experiences. Like I was saying, if you decide, for example, that you're always going to stand up in the same way, and you do that over and over and over again, then what was at one point very self-conscious and very deliberate becomes very natural. You don't have to work at it so hard anymore. Piano is the same. In the beginning, it's playing, and then you have the other hand, and it's really hard, right? And your brain kind of splits. But then one day, it's not so bad. And then you find that there are these basic elements of playing piano that you don't have to worry about anymore. You work on the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing. So none of this is to say that you can't carry that with you. But your story about how you got to the ability that you have, I think, is not useful when you actually play the song. And your story about the musician you are supposed to become, I think also, at the moment that your fingers are on the keys, gets in the way. And I used this example just yesterday, but I always think about a race car driver. Race cars go really, really, really fast, it appears. They're terrifying. And my image, having never driven one, is that just before you get in the car, you might visualize winning. You might see that finish line. And you might even get to hear your own story, because the guy on the news is standing there and saying, this person started when he was 17 years old, whatever that is. But as soon as you hit the gas and you start going 200 miles an hour, I think to be skillful in that moment, you're not going to think about what's coming next. And you're not going to think about how you got there. You're going to think about staying alive in this moment and driving skillfully in this moment. And for that reason, I think that it's very compatible with art. In that, in the moment of creation, you don't want to be limited. You want to have infinite possibility. And that infinite possibility, I think, comes from letting go of your idea about what came before and what will come after, if that makes sense. That said, when we talk about Zen in relationship to art, usually what we're talking about is an idea of mastery that is based on repetition. When you see people practicing calligraphy, they're practicing the same strokes over and over again. In the world of calligraphy, you don't hand a brush to someone and say, do what you want to do. Express yourself. What you're told to do is to express this action. Just this, and to let it reveal itself. in the world of kendo, it's the same. You just do this one thing over and over again. And eventually you become that thing. And that thing reveals itself through you. But the idea is not for you to reveal you. It's for you to get out of the way so that this action can be fully revealed. And I think here we see that in, for example, I have friends who study ballet very seriously. The attitude is the same. You work and you work and you work and you work so that you become sort of invisible. And let those movements show themselves. It's a little different idea from maybe how we sometimes approach it. But I do think that we can be present and creative and involved at the same time. I'm Koun.
Where does one sit in existence when you feel everything that you do and everything you does feels powerful to you, very real, that your brain and feels like you're in a meditative state, just constantly. Whatever you do in your life just seems better than it probably would be, at least to yourself. I don't know. Just you do something that would make that normal person, or whatever you want to know, would do and feel fine about. But when you do it, it feels so much bigger than it probably is. Everything is just so profound and expansive. You feel everything. The feeling that you get from other people, the feeling you get from anything you do, is that sitting here and now, or am I stuck somewhere in my brain?
It's a really interesting question. I think it's the way that we talk about this kind of practice involves some of what you're talking about. This sense of being activated. That a mundane activity can feel very full in a way that not only we don't expect, but that maybe we think would seem off. Why does that guy like washing the dishes so much? Something's wrong with him. His priorities are screwed up. So there's that. But then there's this other question of this feeling of dissonance. This feeling that somehow the experience you're describing is not what's normal, or that a normal person might feel that this is not a true representation of how things are. And to that degree, however much that is there, then our story is still functioning just fine. Right? We're reaping this wonderful benefit of enjoying our lives and feeling activated in our lives. But I suspect, in the way that you describe that, the person who's viewing it through that lens is still limited. Because they're still ultimately comparing their experience to the experience that they think is standard. And playing those two off of one another, moment to moment. But it sounds very nice. Yes.
But sometimes the story I tell to myself about myself is what keeps me from being antisocial or criminal. I mean, in your lecture on compassion, you said that that people might do something that I or society might consider very reprehensible, but they're just trying to be happy. The rapist is just trying to be happy.
Yes.
And so, and then in your lecture on fearlessness, you said, you know, what's your fear? Do it. But taken too far, I can see how that would be a problem if I had no inhibition.
Sure.
Or if none of us had any inhibitions. It's bad enough at the red lights now.
Yes. But this is why I wanted to talk about offering. What are you going to give? What does it mean to shake someone's hand? You have this opportunity in this small encounter, in this encounter that means almost nothing from the outside, to give something. I want you to feel that weight. I want you to raise that question for yourself. If your idea of acting fully is taking from someone, and I would say a rapist is in that category, then in fact, fundamentally, you imagine yourself to be very separate from the world around you, because you feel that there's something you need to get. There's something you need to take and hoard. If you recognize that yourself and the world around you are not separate, you realize there's nothing missing. There's nothing you have to hide in your pocket. There's nothing you don't, if there are 3 cookies on the table, you don't need to take all 3. Because when you eat the one, everybody eats it. And when someone else takes the other one, you get that one too. It's very open. I guess I would also say that my very limited understanding of certain behaviors, in the extreme when you're talking about certain kinds of criminal, pathological behaviors, I think that those behaviors actually don't happen unless we are very deeply immersed in our story. Confused story, but a story. Yes.
During your talk about fearlessness, you discussed Buddha had a brief life when he sacrificed himself for a starving tiger.
Yes.
Do you believe at that moment he was actually able to really sacrifice himself without fear?
So, for anyone who couldn't hear this was a reference to the last talk in February. There's a story, one of the, what they call the Jataka tales. There are stories of the Buddha before the Buddha was the Buddha. And we say, kind of in a mythological sense, that he had a lot of build-up to being the Buddha. He was a very selfless character for a long time before he got to actually kind of sit in that seat of being the Buddha. And one of these stories is that as a young boy, that he encountered a tigress, who was starving, and she had 3 cubs, and they couldn't nurse because she was so malnourished. And he saw this, and he immediately just cut himself open and offered himself, so that the tiger could eat, so that the babies could eat. And the question is, in that moment, could he truly have offered himself? Could he have done that in a fearless way? Yes. My short answer is yes. I believe that very deeply. And again, and this goes back into the last talk, I think that we are able to give at in a way that normal people might think is strange, when we recognize what we have to lose. And from the perspective of this tradition, the answer is there's nothing. You have nothing to lose. What you have is what you have in this moment. And what you have in this moment is what you're doing. And what you're doing is something that you should give away. And then give away again. And then give away again. But he could do that. And again, acknowledging this is a kind of a fairy tale story. But that story becomes possible because there's not an idea of what's supposed to happen next. If he believed that his life is only on course, if next week he finally gets to go to that party he was invited to, he won't do it. But if his definition of his life being on course is that his life is full in this moment, then he can move without fear in this moment. You hope, though, that with time and with age and with consideration, that kind of movement is not simply impetuous but skillful.
So what might you say to the marathoner then who chooses to run those great distances because they enjoy traveling to different places in their mind, and they, for those, chooses to run those long distances because for that particular person,
Particular hypothetical person.
This hypothetical person.
A friend, maybe.
Or really enjoys being somewhere else for that those few hours, more than actually working towards obtaining those fantasies that he or she might be.
He or she. I guess my immediate response, and this is not in any way to take away from the admiration I have for people who commit themselves to that kind of effort. It's incredible. I've never run a marathon. Whenever people say they run a marathon, I just think, wow. That's really inspiring to me. Because I know you don't just wake up one day with the determination to run a marathon. You wake up many days with the determination to run a marathon, and you make it possible over time. It's not a spontaneous act. But what I would say to the person who says that the reason they run marathons is because they like to escape mentally while it's happening, is there are a lot of ways to escape mentally while it's happening. You can rent a movie. There are all sorts of ways. And in fact, one of the things that studies show us is that when you go to the gym and you run on the treadmill and you watch TV, that statistically it's almost impossible to achieve a runner's high. Runner's highs it doesn't happen when you're doing something else. It happens when you're just running. And so I guess I would say two things to this hypothetical person. One is that maybe there's an even deeper experience of running that marathon that's available than what has been experienced up to now. And the other one I would say is that I don't believe the story that this person runs 26 miles so that they can fantasize about being somewhere else. Because there are really easy ways to fantasize about being somewhere else. And so I suspect that there's an engagement and that there's an experience and an involvement in the act of running and the act of being physically present that actually is a part of that person's reasoning. Maybe more than that person is letting on.
So if we're connected, or if we're inseparable from our environment, at what point do we try to control our reality, and at what point do we let nature take its course?
I don't think we have to choose in that way, because nature is taking its course all the time, and we're trying to control our reality all the time. If we imagine what it would be like to not try to control our reality, first of all, we wouldn't get out of bed, because we would just let nature take its course. If nature wanted to somehow get me out of bed, we'd be available to that. That interaction is always going to be complicated. There doesn't have to be someone who's leading and someone who's following. It's an interaction, it's an encounter that's happening. But part of what I want to say is that you can choose to be passive. And my feeling in relationship to my own life and in relationship to this tradition as I understand it is that that's the wrong choice. You step up and I hope we're understanding what we're saying is that control has to do with how we're shaping things, not whether we're controlling people or, but that attempt to give shape to our lives is fundamentally a positive thing. Now, that said, all the rest of Buddhist teachings have to do with attachment and the fact that if you do that with an idea that it has to come out just like so, that's broken. You'll never be satisfied. You'll always be frustrated. And you'll deepen your antagonistic sense that yourself and the world around you are separate. But if you can see, for example, and this is such a small thing, if you can see that when you smile at your coworkers and you live with equanimity, that they are also happier. You see you carry this tremendous power all the time because you also have the power to withhold that. There's this terrible commercial. I haven't seen it for a couple months, but it's for McDonald's. And it's for McDonald's coffee. And this guy is walking on the street and he's just a jerk to everybody. People say, good morning, he says, shut up. And he said, do you want papers? And he won't talk to anybody until he gets his coffee. He won't even be kind to the person at McDonald's until she offers him coffee, and then he gets really nice. And he's like, oh, okay. And then he drinks his coffee, and then he can read his paper, and he can be nice. And on the way home, he's the nicest person in the world. That person is embracing selfishness. That person's story, and this is a good example, that person's story is destructive and violent in the sense that he has given himself permission to withhold himself every single morning until he gets coffee. And it's played up, it's exaggerated in the commercial, but in fact, how many people talk like this? How many people say, don't expect anything from me until I get that cup of coffee? That does not hold water. That's embarrassing. There is no timeline for you to be an adult. There is no moment when you punch in and say, now I'm going to respect the universe. But I don't have to until then because I don't feel quite right. You will never feel quite right. You wake up in the morning and you give everything you have. And you give and you give. And in every moment of that day until the moment you fall asleep, what you find is that you are never empty, that you never run out, that it was never too much, that you never exceeded your limits. And you fall asleep and you wake up the next morning and you do it again. And you do that every single day until you die. And it's not a chore, and it's not a job, and it's not a punishment. It's an honor. And it's an opportunity. And it's a gift. Yes.
How does the child rectify the immediate benefit of his giving of himself to the tiger within consideration of the people that will miss him and the other attachments in his life and the opportunities for greater goods in the future?
I don't think he does. I think he just makes a choice.
Is that a selfish choice in his selflessness?
I think it's a complicated choice. I think that that someone in that situation can come to a different conclusion and have that conclusion be a valid conclusion. Maybe I have a different way of serving. Maybe there's another way to do this. You always have to take this kind of story with a grain of salt, because maybe he could have run somewhere and got a steak and come back. Maybe it didn't have to be all or nothing. But the story is written that way, and all of those stories are written that way, with the specific intention of showing someone giving everything. They're not strategizing. They're not giving half of what they have and making sure that they're being fiscally responsible and putting away for retirement somewhere else. That's never the story. The story is about total offering. And there are actually a lot of them like that. There are other ones where he's a rabbit. He jumps into a fire in front of someone who's hungry so that person can eat. It's great stories. But they're intended to challenge us, to ask, when I think I'm being generous, for example, what's my definition of that? When I think I'm giving my all to something, what's my definition of my all? It's probably different from that character. And that can be like a little nudge for us. Yes?
You were talking of 4 basic fundamentals of your different lectures. There are probably many other compounds or things to put together. If you were thinking of building a base or foundation upon these fundamentals, would it be one more important or 2 put together to continue this growth? Or is it site-specific, instance-specific?
That was simultaneously a very abstract and very concrete question. So the question, as I understand it, is specifically in the realm of this series, which was awareness, compassion, fearlessness, and action. One, is there one that trumps the others? Is that
Or there may be other ones. I wouldn't
question?
necessarily
Okay, not just limited to these 4.
Yes.
And 2,
If that is a true assumption,
okay.
if that's things could be more important than others, is that universally true all the time, or is it site-specific on the specific action that is happening at the time?
One thing that we talked about when we put together the series was what to call it, and living Zen seemed kind of non-threatening, I guess. And what I had first come up with in my mind was Faces of Zen. But it sounded in my head too much like Faces of Death, which are those horrible movies where you watch people actually in high school. My friends wanted to watch this thing, so I thought, well, I can't say Faces of Zen. But in some ways, it would have been a better title, in the sense that for example, if you're practicing compassion, if compassion is actualized, then compassion is one word we're using for awareness. And it's a word we're using for fearlessness. And it's a word we're using for action. So they're all the same thing. To truly actualize, and this is a fundamental part of the teachings in general, to truly do one thing is to do all things. To fully actualize the practice in this way carries with it the totality of the practice. If you give yourself over to this action, if you offer this action, that is not different from the mind of compassion. And that ability to do that is not different from the mind of fearlessness. And none of this arises without awareness. Just to name 4, but as you said, there are more. We can put a lot of angles on this.
It's hard for more of a man to all of them at the same time.
But it's not. And that's part of what I want to say, is you don't have to think, am I doing all 4 at the same time? Just shake the guy's hand. Completely. And without any conscious effort at all, you manifest these other phases of the practice. You don't have to think, now I'm going to be compassionate. That sounds really hard. And I'm going to be aware. That sounds like a superhero kind of thing, where you can turn on your awareness and you know things. That's why I chose this one for the last. And this is why this whole maybe 6 months since we planned this series, I've had a lot of time to think about this one. It's because it was last. And I've noticed as I talk about other things that no matter what I'm talking about, I'm always talking about this. There's only what we're doing. And what we're doing, we can call it this or this. We can say that it has the flavor of this or this. But in the end, you have this moment. And what you do with it is all important. And at the same time, it's not a big deal because the next moment you have to do it all over again. But that action, that giving, that investment in the mundane things in your life, in the things that you think are not important, is what actualizes your whole world. And we discover a completely different value. And that discovery is accompanied by all these other things that we like to talk about in Buddhism. I don't think they're separate at all. They're just different ways of encouraging people. Oh, yes.
If somebody, if somebody tells somebody to do something, like if I tell you for some reason just get off the stage right now, just get up and walk down and get down, and you just do it is that really your decision or was it my decision?
It's mine.
But, I forgot what I was going to say. My teacher always says that a fact is only one thing, an opinion can be many. But sometimes we do these activities and there are many things, and she says nothing's wrong. That means everything must be right. So that means everything is a fact, but she says only one thing can be a fact. So if that can be changed, I wonder if the opinion can be changed and there can only be one opinion. But then wouldn't it be a fact?
These are two great questions. And if you couldn't hear them, so the first question is very concrete. If I tell you to get off the stage, and then you do it, did you make that choice or did I make that choice? To which I say, if I get off the stage, I made that choice. I've mentioned this before because it was actually a big moment in my life, but it was so simple. You know, my father was working one time in the garage, and I was late coming home, and it was because some other kids were doing what they were doing, and they said, "Oh, don't go home yet." And so when I got home, my dad said, "You're late," and I said, "They made me. They made me stay." And he turned around, he was just cleaning things up, and he looked at me, and I still remember the scene so well. He looked down at me, and I was tiny, and he said, "No one can make you do anything." And then he went back to doing what he was doing. And for him, he was kind of chewing me out. But for me, it was like suddenly the world was exploded with light. I had never considered anything as huge as this before in my life. And I realized, that's true! And I cannot say how many times I've gone back to thinking about that. Our actions are always our actions. Always. When we absolve ourselves of responsibility, that's a very deep descent into our story. The other question was also very specific. That in school, the teacher says that there are things that are facts and there are things that are opinions. And that facts are facts and opinions are opinions. And an opinion, there can be a lot of opinions about something, but there's only going to be one thing that's right. But then there are certain activities in which everyone is kind of given permission to be right. I don't know what this teacher's up to. But I will say, either in her defense or in just being a mature, aware human being is the ability to hold two apparently conflicting ideas simultaneously. It's said sometimes with this practice that if it's not a paradox, it's not true. And I always smile when I think of that because I think I have not yet found the exception to it. Yes.
When you speak about your practice and how you stand just so and sit just so, and when you were speaking the other day about Zazen and coming back to I'm in this moment repeatedly, does it ever at the beginning feel a little OCD?
Yes. Yes. It can feel. We are not encouraged, I think, as a culture, to give much attention to what we're doing. And when you start really giving attention to what you're doing, what you realize is there's a lot. There's a lot there. And it can be a little bit overwhelming. The fact is that if ease is the goal, you probably should pay as little attention to what you're doing as possible. Because you can get there, you can get to work. You know, you can get through a shower with almost no awareness of anything you're doing. It's pretty mechanical. You can get through certain relationships by just kind of letting it be and not pushing it too hard. And so part of that is that when we start this practice, I think we kind of open ourselves up to this world. And it's not only huge, but it's alarming because it was always there. So there's that. I actually used to, I don't think I've ever mentioned this to the AZC before. I think when I arrived, I didn't want people to think I was too crazy. But for years, I wore a watch. It's called a watch minder. And some people may have heard of this. It's huge. I think they make them small in HD rooms because they needed these huge batteries. And a lot of the function of the watch minder is for kids who are ADHD. And what it does is you can set it to you can set it to do multiple alarms. That's kind of the purpose of this. And it'll tell you you need to take your meds or whatever that is. You can have it go at certain times. But the other thing you can do, and the reason I purchased it, is because you can set it on random. And the idea is, especially for kids who have trouble paying attention, is they carry this, they put it in their pocket, they can have it vibrate. And at completely random times in the day, it would buzz and a little screen would come up and say, pay attention, pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. And when I saw that in the store, I had to have it. I loved the idea that I would carry around a machine that would actually say to me at non-specific times throughout the day, hey, pay attention, because that's the whole point. And so I wore this thing. My poor wife suffered through me being the guy with the watch that was easy that flashed. I still have. But what you're doing there is you're just trying to build this muscle of paying attention all the time. And at some point you realize, oh, I don't need to wear a watch anymore because I'm doing this to myself. And it doesn't feel crazy. It feels like coming back. It feels like, oh, now I'm here again. This is where I belong. And then I get scatterbrained and then I say, oh, no, this is where I belong. And so that feeling, the thing that you're doing continuously doesn't feel foreign, and it doesn't feel like you're stretching out. It feels like you're returning to home base. Yes.
At that point when you reach your hand out and you're creating a reality, is there, at that moment, is there also a common reality? Or is it just that reality between you and that moment?
Is there another, sorry.
Is there a common reality?
That is the reality.
I mean, does it extend beyond you in that moment to something that's common among?
It extends throughout that moment. And that moment goes way beyond you. That's what these teachings say. It's not just that you're creating a reality that is the bubble around you and the person you're shaking hands with. It's that you're creating a reality that is the totality of reality in this moment. You are the shape of the universe. Again, not in an overlord way. You know, I think of Ming the Merciless pushing the button for hail. You know, if everyone watched Flash Gordon in the 80s. It's not like that. It's that, again, that just on a purely rational level, this moment contains you. That means you're defining it, not alone, but nothing you do is alone. And so you can flavor this moment. You can direct it. But the idea is and this is not something I would ask anyone to just accept because I said it. That what you offer is received throughout reality, regardless of how much of that reality you can see. That's my understanding. Yes.
Koun, I want to thank you so much for being a part of our community.
Thank you.
And sharing all you've shared with us. My question, you said we could ask questions about anything, so my question is, why are you leaving and is someone telling you?
Why am I leaving and is someone telling you to leave? Like anything, there are a lot of answers to this question. I've started to, so I'll tell the story in one way. When I came to the United States, when I came to Anchorage, I had no experience of Zen in the United States. This was a really foreign thing for me. It makes me a little bit weird. There actually is a lot of Zen in the United States. There's a lot of communities there. There's a lot of practice. But I sat with a very small group in Helena, Montana when I was in college. We just met in a church basement, and we would do Zazen, and that was it. So there was a bell. When the bell was hit, we went home. That was no conversation, nothing. That was my experience of Zen. It's this very stark practice. And I knew that there was a lot going on in the rest of the country, but of course I was a kid in Montana. There was only so much that I could see. And then I went to Japan, and it just happened that I fell into my relationship with my teacher there, and I was ordained, and I practiced there. And it seemed very kind of natural to me to do it in that way. So then I came back, and I found myself kind of invited into this community of teachers in the United States. Almost all of whom had trained in the United States had a very different idea about this. And I felt very much like an outsider. And it took me a couple of years to even get a sense of what Zen in America looked like, what the flavor was like. And I had a discovery last year, around this time, when I went to a conference with other priests. We all met in Los Angeles, and we would talk about things. And I don't know why it happened at that time, but we were talking about how the training of priests, which is a real difficulty in this country, and at the end of that conference, I called Tracy, my wife, from the airport, and I said, my whole feeling about this thing has changed. Because I realized in that meeting how critical this topic was. I really started to see the scope of what I consider to be the problem, which is that we're not cultivating the people who will do this in the future. We're not making that a priority. We're doing wonderful things that are historically unique in terms of making this practice accessible to a lot of people. But we're not taken seriously, I think, the issue of who's going to teach. And so, at that time I came home and I talked with Tracy and I said, for the first time I wondered if maybe we weren't going to be in Anchorage forever. Because I started feeling that maybe what I needed to do or what I wanted to do had to do with that kind of larger question. And then there were things that happened at the university that it's all complicated and not very important. But there was a moment when it seemed as if I would not have my university job anymore as of next year. And that led us to think very concretely about how we were going to survive financially and what we could do. And that led my wife to apply to jobs in Japan, and then she was offered one. And suddenly, 8 months after I first had the idea that one day I would not live in Anchorage, we were talking very seriously about leaving in a matter of months, and it happened very quickly. But even though those two things kind of happen separately, to me it feels very connected, because I'm going to go back with my teachers. And for the first time, when I was training in Japan before, and I was there a fairly long time, I was a novice, and I was being trained the way that I was told to train. They say, do this, do this, do this. That'll still be the case. My teacher is still my teacher, and I'm still a student. But for the first time, I feel that I'm going back knowing what I want to learn. And what I want to learn is I want to reach some clarity and some confidence about this issue, about how we're going to cultivate people in the future, so that I can come back here and be useful in that regard. I don't feel that I could be that person today, that I could make the contribution that I want to make today. And I see this as this kind of, this amazing, unexpected opportunity to go back and be a student again. And to try to cultivate something that I hope will be useful. Now, but it's embarrassing in a way for me to say that, because I say that, and then 20 years from now, everyone can Google me and see if I actually did anything. So it's easier to say, well, it just sounds fun. But I have a little bit of a sense of mission maybe, and we'll see what comes of that or what I can do. Yes.
Say something I was wondering in relation to koans and Zen, where they fit.
And I just looked at the clock and realized this has to be the last question. The question is, how do koans and Zazen fit? We could write books about this. So I'm going to really try to sum this up. Koans, for anyone who's not familiar, but it's kind of seeped into the vernacular, are these questions that are attributed to or associated with the Zen tradition. What's the sound of one hand clapping? What was your face before your parents were born? These things that are presented in some ways as kind of riddles. And there's a very strong tradition in the Zen world, in the larger Zen world, of teachers assigning these questions of koans to students, and then kind of guiding them through a process of inquiry. Usually a very frustrating one, where you go back to the teacher and you say, it's this, and he says, no. And you come back and say, well, then it's the opposite, it's no. And then it's this other thing that no one would ever think of, no. And you do this kind of until you hit a wall. And when you hit that wall really, really hard, you come up with something that you couldn't have come up with just trying to win. And that's kind of in the way we read about this from the outside. That would be the moment when the teacher says, nice, and then gives you another one, and you keep going. Traditionally, that's more associated with Rinzai. There are two lines in Zen, Rinzai and Soto. And the Soto tradition has a history of studying koans, but the Soto tradition, which is the tradition in which I was trained, is very interested in the idea, mostly what I've been talking about tonight, that what you're doing is not separate from enlightenment. Which is to say that enlightenment is not something that you're trying to bust into. You're not trying to break down the door so that suddenly the room is full of light and you get it. It's that getting it has to do with how you move in the world in this moment. That enlightenment is fully available and fully present all the time. It's not separate from who we are. It's just that we don't notice it. We don't have that lens. And so we develop that lens by kind of diving in head first into this moment and the next moment and the next moment. But I say that feeling the need to stress that actually there's tremendous overlap between those two traditions. And there are Soto teachers who use koans and there are Rinzai teachers who don't. So they can exist, they can coexist peacefully, or they can sometimes be framed as being opposite camps. But it really depends on who's the teacher, whose hands are they in. I realize that's a very inadequate answer, but there are a lot of people who have written about this in a way that's much more skillful than I could express it. So I would encourage anyone to look at those things. We've gone over time, and I'm sure there's someone standing out there tapping their foot saying, what's wrong with these people? Though I would actually like to stay longer if I could. I really want to thank you. Many of you, I think, have come to all four of these, and many of you have visited the AZC. Some of you never have. It's been such a privilege, though, for me to be able to sit and talk with all of you. I've met so many people in Anchorage, and I've met you all in such a privileged way that I can speak to a room like this, and that the very start of our relationship is this dialogue. Means that everything that comes out of this, for me, is a relationship unlike any relationship that some people ever get to have. So I know I've been so fortunate, and I want to thank you all. And I wish you well.
Thank you all.